If you wouldn't mind, could you just tell us a little bit about how evangelical Christianity has spread in Brazil, a historically very Catholic country? How has evangelical Christianity spread in Brazil?
Yeah, that's a great question. Brazil is historically an overwhelmingly Catholic country. Catholicism was the religion of state. It was an official religion uh, until the end of the 19th century. And then even afterwards, it continued to be, and actually today continues to be the largest Catholic country in the world in terms of number of members of the Catholic religion in Brazil. So it continued to be overwhelmingly historically Catholic for a very long time. But demographers date to about 1970 or so that things started to change in Brazil. And there had long been a small presence of Protestant missionaries and Pentecostal missionaries in Brazil, but things really start to take off after about 1970, and it's in part as a result of urbanization, lots of low-income people moving into cities really quickly, and evangelical and Pentecostal churches take hold in the new low-income areas in the peripheries of large cities. And they also start to spread in other low-income areas in the country, even low-income rural areas in the country. Initially, Protestantism and Pentecostalism then are religions of the poor in Brazil. Despite this long history of liberation theology in the Catholic Church, and that had been particularly powerful in Brazil, at the same time, there was this sort of affinity between Protestantism and Pentecostalism and sort of service to low-income neighborhoods and low-income settlements in Brazil. Over time, so this starts to grow. We gradually find percentage evangelical and Pentecostal rise above 10%. Today, the 2020 census didn't happen in Brazil, in part because of COVID, because the same reason that it didn't happen, that many things didn't happen. But the 2020 census that has not yet happened would have shown that Protestants and Pentecostals constitute about a third of the Brazilian population today. And today, Catholics are a little over half of the Brazilian population, maybe around 55%, but the percentage Catholic is declining in Brazil and will likely fall below 50% this decade if demographers' predictions are correct.
Well, thank you for that. How is religion affecting politics in Brazil? And maybe more specifically, has the growth of evangelical Christianity in Brazil, has it played any role in a changing political landscape? And what's the relationship between the growth of evangelical Christianity and the election of Jair Bolsonaro?
I would say that evangelicalism and Pentecostalism have influenced politics in a few ways. One is that evangelical and Pentecostal churches have tended to be more open to campaigning within churches. So the Catholic Church, as many of our viewers know, is generally resistant to having campaigning happen within churches. It's there are rules from on high about not campaigning within churches, and clergy are not supposed to support candidates. Whereas within evangelical and Pentecostal churches, so first of all, there's a lot less hierarchy, so rules are all over the place. And generally, the culture has been a lot more amenable to having a church have its own candidate or whatever. So actual campaigning happens a lot more within evangelical and Pentecostal churches in Brazil. It has not historically been affiliated with any particular political party. It's just, somebody's corner church has a pastor who has a good friend who is also an evangelical who says, and they say, okay, well, let's try to campaign within the church. And a church if you think about it, a church is a really good place to run a political campaign. You've got a lot of more or less captive followers. If you've got a good audience, and they care about what their clergy say. They have positive feelings towards their clergy, and so this has been a pretty effective mode of politics. Not an extremely effective mode of politics. Not like everybody who goes to this corner church with a pastor who wants to engage in politics necessarily votes for who their pastor tells them to, but it certainly helps. Politicians really believe that the endorsement of local pastors, local clergy, helps their candidacies. So there's been a lot of just politicking within church. As far as what they want, what evangelicals and Pentecostals want when they're in politics. So, I mean, they're conservative on sexuality politics issues, issues of abortion and LGBTQ issues. But in terms of other issues, they're kind of more all over the place. And they've also, historically, many evangelical and Pentecostal churches were really pro-poor. So that's different from politics in the United States. And they were pro-poor in part because, they're serving a clientele, or historically, at least, they were serving a clientele or a faithful, a group of a flock that was largely poor. So they've been conservative on certain kinds of issues and not so conservative on other kinds of issues. They've also, evangelical and Pentecostal churches have historically also fought for the rights of evangelical and Pentecostal churches. Not surprisingly, but it is important. Trying to make sure that there's religious freedom legislation, that the Catholic Church doesn't get what they perceive as undue advantages, and then things like that. So those have been the things that they've been going for. With Jair Bolsonaro, with the rise of Jair Bolsonaro in 2018, so Jair Bolsonaro's rise was not in any way driven by religion. He was an outsider candidate who was responding to tremendous political and economic crisis. Brazil had gone through years of political and economic crisis that led up to the 2018 election. There had been an impeachment of the former president Dilma Rousseff, and so in this context, a person comes in who says, "I am, I'm opposed to all of the old guard." He had been in Congress for about almost 30 years at that point, but he still came in as an outsider candidate who was opposed to all of the old traditional way of doing politics, and he was going to try to reboot the Brazilian political system. So in that context, he comes in, but he does really effectively at attracting, to some extent, conservative Catholics, but especially conservative evangelicals and Pentecostals. And he gets a lot of endorsements from conservative evangelical and Pentecostal clergy. So what about his campaign, you might ask, attracts them to this, to these messages? One big part of it was that he was very strongly the anti-LGBTQ candidate in the election. And he campaigned, that was a really overt part of his campaign. There was also a fake news campaign that was largely run by his own team. So it's kind of like a shadow fake news campaign that ran under the sort of more official campaign that he ran, but it was all linked to his campaign. So this shadow fake news campaign was all about tarring or portraying his opponent, his major opponent, the candidate from the PT, as being really extremely pro-LGBT, and one of the fake news memes, for instance, portrayed his opponent, Fernando Haddad, as be intending to take people's children and forcibly transgender them. Like, we are going to assign a gender to your child. Which is kind of an absurd idea, but this was one of those memes that went viral, was that Fernando Haddad was going to do this. So these kinds of things really resonated in evangelical and Pentecostal churches and in evangelical and Pentecostal networks, because there's a real worry among evangelical and Pentecostal voters in Brazil that sexuality politics and liberalization on sexual issues has gone too far. So this led to these kinds of things, not just those kinds of memes, which seem over the top, but various of these factors led to really strong evangelical and Pentecostal support for Jair Bolsonaro in the 2018 election. Various studies have estimated that Bolsonaro would likely have lost the 2018 election very narrowly to Fernando Haddad if it hadn't been for evangelical and Pentecostal voters. This was really the group that put him over the top, and he got close to 70% of evangelical and Pentecostal voters in the second round election. Yeah, so that doesn't mean that they are going to continue supporting him today, though. Today, evangelical and Pentecostal support for Jair Bolsonaro has declined substantially. And it seems, he's now an incumbent, and so he has to be evaluated based on his current performance.
How do you explain the decline in support for Bolsonaro among evangelicals?
How would I explain the decline of support for Bolsonaro among evangelical and Pentecostals? Well, he's an incumbent. Today, evangelicals and Pentecostals are exposed to the same news media that everybody else is in Brazil. There are sort of media sources that are more oriented towards evangelicals and Pentecostals. Like, there are certain kinds of TV channels that evangelicals and Pentecostals are more likely to watch, but it's not, the new media market is not nearly as segmented in Brazil as in the United States. And so when Bolsonaro is involved in scandals and crises and things like that, everybody hears about it. Even his evangelical supporters hear about his scandals and crises. And so so his support rises and falls among evangelicals and Pentecostals in the same way that support for Bolsonaro rises and falls in the general population. And that's a way in which Brazil is really quite different from the United States. We don't have like these different kinds of entirely different information environments where certain kinds of voters only hear certain information and certain kinds of voters only hear different information. So everybody's exposed to similar information, if not exactly the same. There is social media, so there are social media bubbles, but it's not enough. And so Jair Bolsonaro has been strongly criticized for poor performance on the economy and on coronavirus, and evangelicals and Pentecostals respond to that news the same as other people do.
So the general perception, Amy Erica, is that the Catholics have voted in a more progressive way in Brazil than evangelical Christians. And they voted in a more progressive way in the election of 2018, and many expect them, Catholics that is, to vote in a more progressive way in 2022. For example, voting for Lula, a candidate who will be more on the left of the political spectrum. Do you expect this, in fact, to be the case? How do you expect religion to affect the 2022 election in Brazil?
Yeah, so, Catholics are 55% of the Brazilian population, so they're an extremely diverse group. And it's hard to say. Yes, on average, Catholics will be somewhat more progressive than evangelicals are. Of course, And the non-religious voters are even further to the left and more progressive than our Catholics. There are certainly conservative Catholics who support Jair Bolsonaro. There's a substantial contingent of conservative Catholics. And in fact, one of Jair Bolsonaro's most important sort of inspirations is his quote unquote guru is a conservative Catholic himself. And Jair Bolsonaro actually claims to identify as, he says he identifies as Catholic while his family attends an evangelical church. And Jair Bolsonaro mostly attends an evangelical church, but also continues to publicly identify as Catholic. So it's not to say that there are no conservative Catholics who support Bolsonaro. There are many conservative Catholics who do, but they're all, on average, Catholics will be more likely to support the left and the candidate of the Workers' Party. There has historically been an association between support for the Workers' Party, that is the PT, which is the party of the major party of the left or the center left in Brazil. So there's historically been an association between the Workers' Party and the Catholic Church. And in fact, in the early days of the development of the Workers' Party, there was the Catholic left really in Brazil was supportive of the development of the Workers' Party.
Fake news has often been mentioned as a big problem in the 2018 election. Do you expect that Brazilian society will be any more immune to the problem of fake news?
Well, no. I don't blame Brazilian society for it, though, any more than I blame. I mean, it's a global problem, and one that affects us here in the United States as well. But yeah, I mean, Brazilian society continues to be strongly connected to the internet. If anything, probably somewhat more today, just because of the progress of time and the expansion of cell phone technology than Brazilian society was in 2018. There have certainly been efforts to combat fake news, awareness campaigns, things like that. And I would say there are some recent studies that show that some of this is working a little bit, particularly with, better educated young voters. Better educated young voters are somewhat, more skeptical, more educated, more aware of the problem of fake news. But it's a country still with really low educational levels. And as we know in the United States, even high educational levels are not enough to make someone immune to fake news. So it's going to continue to be a problem. Maybe political elites will be more aware of the problem, and media, like trusted media sources will be more aware of the problem and more able to combat it. That's to be hoped. But, the truth is that there are people who benefit from fake news. Fake news exists because there are people who do well when fake news is disseminated, and they're going to continue to try to disseminate fake news and try to make it work. So it's going to continue to be a problem in Brazil, which is not really very different from the United States.
Amy Erica, do you see religion in any way affecting attitudes towards vaccination against the coronavirus in Brazil?
Yeah, that's a great question. So I would say that a major difference between Brazil and the United States on vaccinations has nothing to do with religion. It's just that Brazilian civil society has been really well trained to get their vaccinations and to get them on time, to do the socially responsible things in terms of vaccination. There is a public health system that has worked really well and has, there's a little cartoon character, Zé Gotinha, who's like literally, like, I guess I would translate as like Joe the little droplet, um, who is who convinces kids. There's like a mascot. Somebody wears the Zegotinha costume and goes and like takes everybody all across Brazil knows that Zegotinha helps kids get their vaccinations. And so there's been a very effective public health campaign to promote vaccinations in Brazil for a really long time. And people are generally accustomed to getting vaccinated. And there's been relatively little vaccine resistance in Brazil, which means that even though vaccinations were slower to roll out in Brazil and the country had a lot less access to vaccinations initially, now they're doing really, really well because of lack of vaccine hesitancy. But there is some hesitancy, and the hesitancy that there is seems to be more strongly concentrated among evangelical and Pentecostal groups. So this is probably in part about politics, because evangelicals and Pentecostals have tended to be supportive of the president, Jair Bolsonaro. And Jair Bolsonaro, despite what I've just told you about public health, Jair Bolsonaro himself, the president, has been really resistant to vaccinations. So he's been basically trying to go against the grain, swim upstream, by trying to make Brazilians skeptical of vaccines with respect to COVID. And I think because many evangelical and Pentecostal clergy have been supportive of Jair Bolsonaro, some of them have also come on board with vaccine skepticism. There also, particularly within some Pentecostal churches, has been some emphasis on sort of miracle healing. I mean, this is of course, there is a part even of Catholicism that has an emphasis on miraculous healing, but I think Catholicism has generally been pretty compatible with science. But the idea of miracle healing has been really, really important in Pentecostal and neo-Pentecostal churches. And so part of this has also kind of gotten involved in the in all of this, is that this idea that, well, if you really believed, Jesus would just heal you from COVID. So that's also been something of a barrier at times.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you. That's really great. Thank you. Yeah, you've been so patient with us. So thank you.